Get us started. My name is Dr. Theodore Foster. I'm an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I'll be hosting tonight's guest lecture and conversation from Dr. Ahmad Greene-Hayes and Dr. James Howard Hill. To begin, I'm going to read a bit about this speaker series that we have for you all this semester that's kicking off tonight. So welcome for spending your evening with us this Friday in March. I want to thank our sponsors to begin, the Department of English, Department of History, Gilboa Charitable Trust, Office of the Provost, and many others at UL who were able to make this speaker series happen. And so this is Conversations in Black Study, which convenes 10 scholars whose collective work deepens our understanding of the interdisciplinary field of Black studies across important themes such as religion, Black feminisms, gender and sexuality, Black and Native literature, affect theory, Black politics and organizing traditions, digital humanities, and public history. I want to offer a brief quote to help ground our understanding of Black studies and Black study from Dr. Badura Lagra, who gave an excellent lecture for us last year titled Sunlight Through the Fog, Caribbean Thought and the Promise of Black Studies, in which she wrote and spoke. I want to suggest that Black studies rightfully holds in awe and Black study is to enact the break. Both necessary, but one holds us and the other releases us. Black study means holding the tradition, not to build new cathedrals, but for the purpose of eventually tugging at the threads until it breaks. This year's theme is grounded by the above epigraph, distinguishing Black studies from Black study. And I just mentioned Dr. Badura Lagra's presentation, which can be found archived in the Gilboa Center for Public History website, where this conversation is also intentionally archived. As a break from institutionalized forms of Black or African-American diaspora studies, Black study confronts rather than resolves internal contradictions within the field. This year's focus on the power of transformative conversations takes seriously the practice of critical dialogue as a path toward Black study that is rooted in the histories and traditions of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and Grace Lee and Jenny Boggs' 1978 text, Conversations in Maine. Traditional academic disciplines such as history, English, sociology, political science, and anthropology have all made substantial breaks with dehumanizing traditions of Western thought rooted in colonialism, and thus the work of Black study is relevant to future scholarship across and research across disciplinary formations of knowledge production and teaching. I would add to that religious studies, and indeed today's talk seeks to bridge the gap between Black religion or Black religions and Black study. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speakers, who will talk a bit about their research to begin. They'll offer each other questions about two of the pieces they offered for our reading group to discuss. We had a robust conversation last Wednesday, or just 2 days ago, for an hour with our undergraduates and graduate students and faculty. And so we're excited to extend that to you all today. So first, Dr. Ahmad Greene-Hayes is a college fellow and assistant professor of African American studies with a courtesy appointment in the Department of Religious Studies at Northwestern University. He earned his PhD in religion from Princeton University, and he also earned certificates in African American studies and gender and sexuality studies. His research interests include critical Black studies, Black Atlantic religions in the Americas, and race, queerness, and sexuality in the context of African American and Caribbean histories. Dr. Greene-Hayes is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Gods of the Flesh, Black Atlantic Religion Making in Jim Crow New Orleans, which is under advanced contract with the University of Chicago Press in the Class 200 New Studies in Religion series. The book examines the Black Atlantic religious cultures and sexual politics that emerged in New Orleans, a vibrant American port city amidst Jim Crow policing and the migration of African Americans, West Indians, and Central Americans to the region in the early 20th century. It also tracks intraracial and intercultural conflicts among Black religious practitioners within the Negro church and between quote unquote Negro cults and sects. Relatedly, the book also considers the world of policing encircling Black people during the era of Jim Crow, a period in which policing included the jail cell and the state-sanctioned court of the lynch mob. And it centers how Black people countered them through new and rescripted Black Atlantic religious, political, and sexual cultures. So we welcome Dr. Ahmad Greene-Hayes to this call. I also want to briefly introduce Dr. James Howard Hill, who is currently acting assistant professor of religion at the University of Oklahoma, where his research and teaching examines 20th and 21st century US lived religious experience, the construction of celebrity, and the politics of Black popular culture. His scholarship has been recognized and supported by the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Forum for Theological Exploration, the Louisville Institute, Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion, Northwestern Social Science Research Council, as well as Northwestern University's Mellon Cluster Fellowship for Promising Research in Comparative Race and Diaspora Studies. So without further ado, I want to welcome you all to this conversation and turn it over to you to have a critical dialogue, and then we'll have about the last 15 minutes of the call for Q&A. So turn it over to you all.
Yes, no, first, thank you so much, Dr. Foster. Thank you, University of Louisiana, Lafayette, everyone who played a role in putting this together. I'm honored to be here and be in conversation with you all. I mentioned with my dear brother, Ahmad, Dr. Greene-Hayes, that I was going to sample him. So thankfully, he cleared the sample for my introductory remarks. I actually want to sample a work of his that I've been thinking with for quite some time that I'm going to, as part of my questions, is actually what we discussed on Wednesday, discredited knowledge. And so as I was thinking about, or discredited knowledge is, so as I was thinking about what I should say in the form of an introduction, I began thinking about those discredited knowledges in my own life. And it took me to my own father and my own mother, my own family. Because as I'm thinking about how I arrived at this moment, how did I arrive and how am I thinking with and thinking through Black study as a scholar of religion, what came to my mind, I wasn't thinking that this was going to come to my mind, but what came to my mind was my father. My father is a Baptist preacher. He's a complicated, beautiful, haunted and haunting brother. But I didn't know the brilliance of my father until I started pursuing study. And what I mean by that is, when I was in seminary, I have a degree in seminary and have 2 degrees in seminary. When I began to go outside of my home and outside of my community, I began to hear stories that for folks who grew up in so-called religious homes, religious spaces, even those who weren't necessarily growing up in religious spaces, that there was certain music they were not allowed to listen to. There were certain films they were not allowed to watch, certain comedy, certain cartoons even, right? But for my dad, who was a Black Baptist minister, is a Baptist minister, beautiful musician, there was never music I was not allowed to listen to. There was never films I was not allowed to watch. In fact, one of my earliest memories is in the booster seat driving to St. James United Methodist Church to hear my dad preach. And as I'm driving there, in my Walkman was Prince's Purple Rain. Now, we can have a conversation if a 4-year-old should be listening to Purple Rain, but my dad knew that I was listening to Purple Rain. And as I'm thinking through, as I'm excited about this conversation, I'm thinking through this conversation, I have this image of my father crouched over the boombox with his 2 fingers over the play and the record. My father would wait for an hour because he knew a world premiere Michael Jackson single had just dropped. And he would not have this image of my dad sitting over that boombox with those 2 fingers. Then when he heard it, he pressed play and he'd record that song. And when that song finished recording, he would then take it out, or he would keep it in and record a few other songs. And he would take it out and he would grab a Sharpie. And on that Sharpie, he would write something like Junior's Jams or Junebug's Jams. And he would give that to me. And then when he found out that I was watching music videos, I didn't know how he got the money. He and my mother got the money, but he subscribed to Word Up Magazine and he would read me Word Up Magazine. And he would then take the images, the little pop-up posters of Arrested Development and A Tribe Called Quest and Leaders of the New School and Janet and Whitney, and he would put them all on the wall. And he would ask me their names. And the reason why I'm bringing that up in the form of the introduction is it took me so many years to realize that my father was my first research assistant, that my aunties and my uncles and my first cousins, they weren't just talking about music because the little Junebug loved music. They knew that I was pursuing a line of study. They didn't use the language of study. They didn't know what cultural theory was. They didn't know the Frankfurt School from the Birmingham School from whatever school, but they knew that Junebug watched music and Junebug loved music videos and Junebug loved comedy. So my dad would take a VHS and he would record after Bobby Jones' Sunday Gospel Hour. He would record Donnie Simpson's videos. And he would record Yo MTV Raps. And if Michael was performing on the MTV Awards, he'd record that. And he created my first archive, right? And so as we're thinking about Black study together, I wanted to sample my dear brother, Dr. Greene-Hayes' wonderful work on discredited knowledge, because for so many years, I discredited the fact that my first research assistants. The first folks who told me about the archive, it wasn't an advisor, it wasn't a senior scholar, it wasn't the brilliant scholars who we're going to be talking about this evening, without their work I wouldn't be here. It was my father. It was Sugar Man is his name. It was Sugar Man. It was Nita Girl. It was Boom, Wanda Maynard, who knew that Junebug loved music, and they moved heaven and earth to make sure I had an archive to pursue study. And so it wouldn't be right for me to begin a conversation about Black studies with all the brilliant minds out there without first grounding myself in the brilliant, beautiful, haunted and haunting Black people who first knew that I wanted to pursue study when they didn't have the language for it, but they knew that I wanted to pursue study. And like I said, they moved heaven and earth to make that possible. So I'm just privileged to be here tonight to continue that conversation and honor Black study, but also honor the discredited knowledge and the discredited producers of knowledge who not only made Black study possible, but they made my Black life possible.
Wow. Thank you. First, I'll begin by thanking Dr. Foster for the invitation, and the University of Louisiana Lafayette as well for hosting us, and to Dr. Hill, thank you so much for that opening comment and embrace of that piece, which I now think of, as you know, as a work in progress, even thinking about how there are parts of that piece I no longer even resonate with. And yet I think of Black study exactly as we are all works in progress. And so I appreciate you for bringing that to the fore. You know, just similarly, I come to the Black study of Black religion out of, you know, growing up in the Black church as a tradition. And so a tradition marred by complexity and contradiction. My grandfather was a preacher, pastor, and a Rolling Stone. My grandmother was a part of a denomination that would not allow her to teach or preach. And then outside of that context, she was an educator for 30 years. My great-grandmother was the head of the church kitchen. And at home in her kitchen, she was, you know, doing root work. And so just thinking about a certain kind of herbalism that was a part of the tradition, but at least not outwardly celebrated and public. And so thinking about contradiction and complexity as the way in which I enter any kind of conversation, sitting with the messiness and the gray of Black life. I think Black religion as a category, as a series of traditions that fall under this umbrella term, contradiction is precisely where I enter. And I think for far too long in Black studies, the contradictions and complexities of Black religion often mean that we do not take Black religious actors seriously, or we confine Black religious actors to the space of social conservatism and then denounce or disregard any kind of religious sensibility as a way in to think about surviving and traversing anti-Blackness. And so I wanted to begin there because it's just honest. And so that's exactly how I enter the conversation. And then secondly, for me, I come to the Black study of religion through Black studies. I was trained, you know, in an Africana studies program in undergrad, and that was the entry in. And it was just the first time I had encountered scholars who gave me permission, you know, someone who grew up in Baptist and Pentecostal context gave me permission for the first time ever to question the traditions that I came up out of. And it was a cautious questioning, but a questioning nonetheless, that then opened a whole portal for me to think about race, sexuality, and religion in the context of Black life. And so that's really, you know, thinking about the personal, thinking about the autobiographical. I cannot denounce that. And so I also appreciate you for bringing a family and kinfolk who have shaped us into this space as a starting point. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Yeah, no, you know, I'm gonna flip it right back to you, family. Like I said, you know, I'm glad you even alluded to it, because I want my first question. And I'm glad I get to love on you and your work in public, because you know I've been not just, you know, following your work, but being a having the privilege of being a brother of yours, as we pursue study together, I get to ask you these questions out loud. So I want to just first start off where we've been in those discredited knowledges. You mentioned how you have if I can say, a critical appreciation and a critical love for your own work. So if you could just speak to what you were thinking and what you were working through when you originally, put the piece together. And if you can also, after you do that, just expound on how you're thinking about the piece now, how are you thinking about discredited knowledges, and where, if you still find that term useful for you, and if so, where are you thinking about taking it moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think it's important. I think I'll start with where I agree with myself. I do believe that Black folks, so the discredited knowledges piece is definitely drawing upon Toni Morrison's notion of discredited knowledges based on her wonderful article, Rootedness, the Ancestor as Foundation. And that is a piece I've been reading almost every year since I was an undergrad, and it's shaped my worldview in a number of ways. For one, I've always appreciated Morrison's homage to the ancestor, and it's something that she's very clear on in that piece, that is her political imperative in her African-American literature, right? It is her imperative to center the ancestor. There's this line in the piece that she says, when you kill the ancestor, you kill yourself. And so thinking about how there's a mirroring between this world and other worlds, or another world, and how we are to keep the ancestors alive, especially in a world where Black folks don't have any kind of access or access to any kind of life force, right? There's a way in which life is always actively being seized and taken from Black folks. And so what does it mean to keep ancestors alive? And so opening up a different set of questions about African cosmology, thinking about how Black folks are at once disembodied, dismembered, and yet there is a certain kind of embrace of otherworldly imaginings of the soul or the spirit, right? These terms that are circulating in enslaved people's literatures. And so I'm trying to think through what that means. What does it mean to not have a certain kind of valuation of the body, but a valuation of the soul or the spirit? Like, what is that? And I think for a long time, Black religious studies scholars often turn to joy and to play and to jubilation and celebration and all these other terms. And it gets away from the violence and the brutality of the system of slavery, of domination. But there is something to be said about the function of prayer or the chanted sermon or these other modes in which Black folks are communing with other worlds. And so I think that that's where I am still wrestling and still trying to make sense of. I think the points where I disagree with myself is perhaps around a certain kind of timidness around thinking about brutality more forcefully. And I think this is part of, I'm thinking with Sylvester Johnson here and Lerone Martin and others who have really pushed Black religious studies scholars to deal with empire, to deal with the stuff that we like dance around. And there's a way, even in that piece, I am recapitulating those very same things by turning to the slave narrative or the sermon as a way of getting away from what Patsy, right, is talking about, or getting away from like what Turner is dealing with. And I think we just don't have the vocabulary, the tools in our field to really, really deal with domination. And I'm trying to think about, how do I deal with that without discounting religious sensibilities? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a delicate dance one has to do, I think, with honoring ancestors while also naming the violent institutions by which they actually became ancestors.
No, yes, and Ashe.
Yeah, and I will flip it back to you, because I'm actually thinking about how what I know of your work and both your scholarship, but then also your familial, personal commitments There is a attention to photographs and videographs and various forms of multimedia as an attempt to curate your own archive and to keep your ancestors alive. And so I'm wondering if you could just say more about why those mediums appeal to you and what might they actually do for your work as a Black studies scholar in Black religious studies?
No, I appreciate those questions. I think about my favorite quote comes out of the Gospel of Thomas, right? It's if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you, right? And so I'm haunted. I'm haunted. My name is James Howard Hill Jr. I am named after the most beautiful and terrifying person I've ever known and will ever know, who was a brilliant and is a brilliant documentarian. It was during the pandemic where we were inside like everybody else, and we actually moved from Evanston back to Evanston, Illinois, back to outside Dallas and Mesquite, Texas, with my mother to just be close to family. And in my mother's attic, her and my father had been divorced now for nearly over 15 years, but we knew that my dad in the early 90s, because we were there, he always carried the VHS, the big old VHS, right? And so I ain't have nothing to do. It's a pandemic, so I'm like, I got to pass this time, somehow. You can only binge, some on Netflix for so long. So I'm like, let me go ahead and get these dusty VHSs, right? And so I go and grab this huge box and I bring it downstairs, and thankfully it's mama's house. You got a VHS somewhere, right? So plugged up the VHS, and I just thought I was going like, okay, yeah, get to see some family, get to reminisce. And family, when I tell you, I stood there and I couldn't get past the first 30 minutes and I was a puddle. It was just because I saw people who are not here anymore, great grandparents and great aunties and great uncles, and not just the dead. I think that's when I talk about the archive and home videos and amateur filmmaking as archival sources. We're not just talking about the dead in a sort of literal sense. In one respect, I saw first cousins who I'll never see again because of the prison industrial complex. You know what I mean? I saw, and seeing their joy, seeing I want to call their names, my cousin Robert, so many beautiful Black men who are beautiful Black boys, and seeing their joy, seeing them run across the fields, and watch my dad, who's a Vietnam veteran, who was an 18-year-old Black boy shipped off during the fall of Saigon, right, and came back, with stories of war, and came back with other things, and struggled with the disease of addiction ever since. But to watch my dad throwing footballs, to watch my dad playing, like having the video camera, and just there's a scene that broke me down, beloved. There's a scene where my dad's watching us and my cousins play basketball. Our neighbor, Mr. Bailey, rest in peace, had a basketball court in his front yard. So he's watching us just have a good time. And then he shifts the camera up to the trees, just blowing in the summer. And for 3 minutes, beloved, it's just the wind and the trees. And as I'm sitting on my couch, I'm just the tears, because like my dad, I'm in this moment. It wasn't the barbecue. It was in the moment where my dad focused the camera on some temple leaves and some temple branches for 3 minutes. I said, God damn, this man's an artist. He's an artist. And it was in that moment I got it. Like, I'm estranged from my father. We'll probably never talk on this side. But in that moment, family, it came to me like, that's why he was carrying that damn camera. He's an artist who is tortured, an artist who's seen war, and you talk the ravages of empire, and grew up in Temple, Texas in the 50s and 60s. And all he has is that goddamn camera. And so he focused that camera on dirt because his granddaddy was a horticulturalist. He focused that camera on flowers. There's a scene where he has the camera on a tripod. And for one VHS, family, one VHS, it's just me playing with Legos. So what is my dad communicating in 1992, knowing what we know about just Black children, period. My father, you can say wasted or whatever, used the whole VHS on his black son playing Legos for 2 hours, and he's singing gospel in the background. I needed that video. I needed those collections. Like I said, I write about, and something I'm thinking through is the strangeness of estrangement, right? Because I'm currently, as of this day, I'm estranged from my dad for multiple reasons. But my dad is brilliant. My dad is an artist. My dad is a documentarian who used amateur film and used that big old VHS to document not just his family, but to document, the last story I'll share about this, but to document great aunt, everybody, almost everybody dead at this point in terms of the elders, document great aunts, great uncles going into their homes during Christmas. He would go to gas stations where they would frequent and take he was a documentarian. But but my mother and my father have been divorced for 15 years, necessarily so. We'll just leave it at that. And one night she just came on the couch and she sat down. She knows about these home videos. They're in her home. And there was a point in the home video that my mother was not expecting. My father took the VHS, got in the car, and drove to the Bluebonnet Cafe. His mother did not work at the Bluebonnet Cafe. My mother's grandmother, my great-grandmother, worked at the Bluebonnet Cafe. And my mother always told me a story, but I had no visual imagery to go with it. She told me a story about how when she was 18 years old, full of Black pride, she got tired of my great-grandmother going through the back to the Bluebonnet Cafe. And so one day she said, "Medea, you don't have to go through the back of the Bluebonnet Cafe. You're gonna walk straight in the front with those other Black folks, with everybody else, and you're gonna make those white folks, see you for who you are." So my mother took Medea to the front of the back, because we liberated now, right? You can go through the front. And she took Medea to the front, and she noticed how all the white folks were just staring at her. And my mother just coiled, but Medea just held her hand. Estella Mae Allen just held her hand, went to the back. And when my mother tells the story, when she went to the back and opened those doors, she heard Black music playing. She heard Mr. Lemon laughing and joking and singing, and saw the Black workers in the back just having a good time. And my grandmother, God rest her soul, great-grandmother, looked at my mother and just said, "Now, baby, you see why I don't need to go in the front?" And that story was always in my family. My dad took the VHS to the back of the Bluebonnet Cafe and put the camera on all of those beautiful Black faces, those discredited knowledges that you're talking about. And as my mother sat in that, she didn't talk to my daddy in years, probably ain't gonna talk to him again. She started shaking. The tears started coming down because she ain't seen her great-grandmama in years. And once again, it was at that moment where I said, God damn, this man was an artist. The disease of addiction and everything, he knew. He knew how beautiful Estella Mae Allen was. He knew about the Bluebonnet Cafe. He knew about that dirt. He knew about those leaves, and he kept it. So one day, a pandemic or no pandemic, I'd find those VHSs. And I don't know if he knew that he would overcome his addiction. Overcome the disease of addiction. But if I ever found those videos, I would learn something about him. And by learning something about him, I'd learn something about me. And so I pick up the camera to keep that conversation alive with my dad through the sort of chasm of estrangement. And so I think that from that, I want to flip that back to you, family, because I think we're still in this stream of the archive. Because one thing I admire about your work, and you're so vocal about it through social media and just through knowing you, is about just the violence of the archive. As we know from, I think Hartman wrote, it's like the archive as mortuary, right? This idea of just everything that's an archive. I want to hear you talk about that. But if you can speak specifically as a historian, as a Black historian, particularly with your work in New Orleans, of just what you go through, what you endure, what you have to sift through in terms of the archive, but specifically, can you speak to being a scholar of Black religious history and the distinct challenges you face as a Black religionist attending to the violence of the archive in your work?
Mm. Well, first of all, thank you, James, for sharing that very intimate familial history. I think those stories most assuredly shape our work, and so just want to honor that for bringing that into space. To attend to your question, for me, the archive is a site of violence and dismemberment. It is a graveyard. It holds all sorts of very, very brutal narratives about Black existence. And for me, as for work that's situated largely in what I'm starting to call now in my work, the long quote unquote emancipation period, really attending and thinking with Hartman about the non-event of emancipation, right? And thinking about, post 1865, well into the early 20th century, thinking about recapitulations of the plantation, thinking about plantation nostalgia, thinking about various brutalities that are shaping, encircling Black life and Black people and Black religious institutions. And with that said, lots of the sources that I work through include white folks, calling Black folks every name possible. Most recently, I'm currently working through some material that's in the 1880s, 1890s in New Orleans. And, I'm struggling to write this chapter precisely because of how profoundly racist the material is. Thinking of what does it mean to, first of all, the white imagination is a site of terror by itself. The lengths and bounds upon which white people imagine Black subjectivity is something that I don't think we fully wrapped our heads around. And so thinking about right now Vodou in New Orleans as this it becomes a trope, even as it is a religion. And largely white folks are imagining the Vodou ceremony as an orgy, right? This becomes the language of the day. Black folks are believed to be performing midnight orgies in the service of foreign African gods, and are calling upon these quote unquote barbaric forces to enact violence on white families and institutions. And lots of that rhetoric is coming out of a certain fear of Black rebellion. And so Black religion is seen as a catalyst for Black rebellion. Spirit possession is seen as a catalyst for rebellion. And so there is this interest in policing Black religion. And so I think about that moment in particular, because I think a lot of people don't understand how we get to a certain kind of Protestant centrality in Black religious life. There's a reason that a lot of Black folks are forsaking, right? I think forsaking is perhaps the right language, largely non-Christian traditions in the service of Christian institutions. And a lot of that has to do with, a question about survival. How do we survive the lynch mob? And so, embracing a certain kind of Christian social respectability becomes a way to circumvent in their minds, right, racial and sexual terrorism. And we know, right, the literature is clear, the historiography is clear that hoodoo and conjure and all these other practices persist inside of these churches, right? We think about the Church of God in Christ, right, the largest Black Pentecostal denomination. Historian Yvonne Chareau argues that the founder, Charles Mason, was a conjurer preacher, right? He is performing certain kinds of rituals with natural objects and preaching about it, and conducting healing ceremonies with those same objects. And that is the founding of this denomination. And so what happens that these traditions disappear largely to some degree by the time you get to the mid-century. What's going on such that there is now outright denunciation of non-Christian religious practices. And it is it's an embrace of Christian social respectability, but there is a larger effort to be a part of the American nation. Like this becomes the political rhetoric. It's about assimilating. It's about being a part, so much so that there is a distancing from one's African past. And so that is a particularly violent experience, even as those Black Christian actors, right? We might think of like Booker T. Washington, for instance, or we might think of some individuals who are leading certain factions of Black social movements. They see themselves as doing work in the service of Black people. And for a lot of them, they also enact a certain kind of violence on folks who are in the Black slum. They are enacting violence on the Black sex worker, right? They're enacting violence on the hoodoo practitioner. They're calling on the policing of these individuals. And so this is like precisely where my work rests, like trying to think, how do we get to this moment? And then what are the legacies of that moment in our contemporary moment, right? What do we think about the rise of, certain kind of televangelism that is completely divorced in some instances from any kind of social narrative about Black people suffering. And so there's a long history here, in other words. And so that's precisely where my work rests. But I think, James, as you were talking, I also was thinking about your research, right? And I think even as I'm talking about contradiction and complexity and the kinds of violences that Black religious actors enact upon Black people, there's something in your work, in your centering of the Jackson Five and of Michael Jackson, the Jackson family, that I've been really captivated by your centering of this family, precisely because as I read you and as I hear you, I think you're inviting us as Black religious studies scholars to confront the individuals who look just like us, who mirror our complexities and contradictions, but we have perhaps been too afraid to embrace or accept, right? And so there's a larger question here about what do we do with Black folks in the Black religious past, right? Who we have been taught to discard and to jettison precisely because they are too freakish, or they're too strange, or they're too problematic, right? And so, can you just talk a little bit about what does it mean to center a celebrity that is marred by all of that propaganda around the freak and a certain kind of disdain for a celebrity, even as we articulate it and attracted to it? If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no. I appreciate that. It's an important question. I'm thinking about, also this leads to talk about citational practices as well, and who I'm thinking with as a Black man in the field, that particularly Black women and women identifying scholars who are so important for my work. So the most difficult chapter that I had to work through, both for the Dis and what will be the forthcoming book, is the second chapter. The second chapter is tentatively titled the Pained Witness of Little Michael Jackson. Because what I think one of the many things that has led me to this work, and to quote, Dion Brand, who I think sharp cites in the work, is sitting in the room with history, right? And so when I read In the Way, that sentence wouldn't let me go, because what immediately came to my mind, I was still in the early stages, but what is it? I began to really think with Brand, what does it mean to sit in the room with Michael? To sit in the room with the gift and the trouble. And I think that one of the points I'm making in this work is that far too many folks, it'd be too easy to just say oh, it's white folk, right? No, it's far too many of us just don't really want to talk about that pain body of that little boy, right? And I want to make that point because, consistent with victims of child abuse, particularly corporal punishment, and just child abuse across the gamut, Michael became a man. Talk about thing. He wouldn't let us let that go. Whenever folks want to talk about the gift, the magic, the tours, from Oprah Winfrey to Martin Bashir to anybody who gave that Black man a microphone and time, he talked about what happened to him as a boy. He talked about the conditions of possibility from through which the gift emerged. So we wanted to talk about afros and beautiful noses and Soul Train and the Ed Sullivan Show. And Michael was like, but do you know what it took to get that, baby? Do you know what happened to me? Do you know what I'll never get back? And so when you think about, it's not just enough to say, you know, his daddy did something, but there's something that I believe that when Michael invites us to sit with the trouble, to sit with the pain, I think that's why I'm thinking with Hartman's notion of pained flesh and pained body, to really think with the pained body of that little boy, because there's something that I noticed in the wake of Leaving Neverland that folks began to really say, and I think necessarily so, I don't want to devalue this sentiment, like, I can't listen to Thriller anymore. I can't listen to, you know, the cuts from Bad or Dangerous. I understand that 100% and sympathetic to that. But they never said anything about the Motown years. Like, they never said, like, I can't listen to Rock and Robin. I can't listen to I Want You Back. I can't listen to, so there's something about, there's a question like, so what are we saying about the conditions of possibility for that beautiful Black boy to become an Advent? What are we saying about Berry Gordy and that Motown assembly line that he calls, when he talks about the Jackson Five, they were the last group to really to be developed through what he calls the Motown assembly line, to take pained bodies and transfigure them into spectacular bodies, right? And Michael is always talking about that process. And what was gained, he's very clear about what he gained and what was gained in that process, but he also talks about the pain in that process. And what I noticed in just looking at media reception and the mediation of that witness is that there's part of that story that just doesn't really pick up, right? And so in part of that chapter, what I think through the way through popular culture has really reproduced those scenes of violence and laughed about it. I draw upon a scene from the first season of Martin, called the Variety Show episode that some of you may be familiar with, where Martin Lawrence, Martin Payne in the show, he's directing a variety show for the radio station WZUP, and one of his best friends, Cole Brown, wants to audition, and he says, like, Martin says, "What do you do?" He says, "I do a mean Michael Jackson impersonation." So we're thinking like, oh, he's about to do the hee whatever. And what Cole begins to do is reproduce the scene of the violence, right? He starts, I won't reenact it, but he starts like pretending to be little Michael getting beaten. And what you hear is just raucous laughter from the studio audience, right? It was meant to be comical. And you can, and there's even not just in the 90s, but Roddy Ricch has a verse on the song Brand New, where he says, you know, I'm in the trap whipping up Jacksons. He said, I'm in the trap whipping up Jacksons like Joe, basically, right? And so it's still being, but yet it's not an anomaly. I can keep going with different examples of the pained body of little Michael Jackson still being produced, and we see how that continued as an adult. Many of us are aware of the Pepsi burning episode, right, where Michael was burned by, you know, a multi-billion-dollar corporation. According to Michael, Michael says literally Pepsi did it. And in 1989, last thing I'll say, in 1989, Neil Young won MTV's Video of the Year. That same MTV that Black man saved in many ways just 6 years earlier. Neil Young wins Video of the Year for a video entitled This I believe it's This Note's for You, where he reproduces that scene. He reproduces Michael. He has a Michael Jackson lookalike get burned on screen, and guess who pours out who douses the flame on Michael Jackson's burning black head? A Whitney Houston lookalike. So Neil Young has a Whitney Houston lookalike pour Pepsi on the burning skull of Michael Joe Jackson. MTV gives him MTV's video music, gives him Video of the Year. That same MTV that would later name an award the Michael Jackson Video Vanguard Award gives Neil Young Video of the Year. And all this conversation about Neil Young and so many other folks, how many conversations have we had about This Note's for You and how a white man won Video of the Year for burning a black man on screen and had a black woman pour it out? If that's just lost in the conversation, how was that lost? So to your point, as I'm thinking about the sort of the construction of infrequent and estrangement, and really how I think is part of the conversation for scholars of religion, it's a secular discourse in many ways, right? So Michael is a private person who made private decisions in his private life. He got so much money that he did this to his nose, he did this to his skin, even though that's also a discourse in ableism because he had multiple autoimmune diseases, vitiligo and discoid lupus that gets, you know, lost in the conversation. But he did all this stuff to his body because he got too much money as an individual. The management of the religion as a Jehovah's Witness, which doesn't get discussed, the management of his Blackness and race, right? And as James Baldwin brought to our attention in 1985, he said the Michael Jackson cacophony is fascinating in that it has nothing to do with Jackson at all. According to James Baldwin, he says all this noise is about America. You're making it sound like this is about a black man who got too much money. But what he's doing with his body, the way he's blurring gender lines and bringing out questions of sexuality and all these other things, like what he's doing in the wake in these Reagan years, neoliberalism, what he's doing to transform himself, to brand himself, it's not outside the discourse of this country. And so if we're thinking about Michael Jackson and plastic, and Michael Jackson and shape-shifting, and Michael Jackson augmenting form, and that conversation begins with the scalpel and a Hollywood surgeon in 1980s, but it doesn't begin in 1969 with a beautiful Black boy going through an assembly line to be thrusted out in front of the world in the wake of a burning America. If you're thinking about Michael Jackson and shape-shifting in the 80s, but not in the 60s, and the whole discourse about that little Black boy is lost, right? Or it's just a private affair between he and his daddy. That's not what he said. And so I think to this thing that we've been talking about, family, about this, I think you used it in your work, this idea that what does it mean to sit with the full discourse of the trouble, right? The full weight of the trouble, the gift and the horror, because all of it is haunted, right? And so, yeah, as we're dealing with Mike, I just really, in the work in the Jackson family, there's just a way I'm fascinated by the way many folks discuss Michael in this sort of private, personal, detached from us, and we can adjudicate from afar, as if what Stuart Hall and so many cultural theorists show us that Michael constituted some things, but he was constituted. When we look at media, it's a two-way street. We produce as we are being produced. So to act as if Michael is this thing over there that we can adjudicate from afar with no responsibility, no culpability, no engagement. We are not entangled in the horror of the haunting as well. That is just ill. Look at him. I don't think we're really looking at it, because I don't think Michael says that he's fine. I don't think Michael says he's not strange. Michael is asking us what makes us think that we so put together, right? And so I think that I know we're about to go into another mode, but just in the few moments that we have in this segment, I'm also interested in this question of citational practices. Can you just lift up, family, in the few moments we have in this moment, just who are you thinking with, particularly knowing just as Black men in this field, knowing how the brilliant work of so many of our colleagues, trans colleagues, gender nonconforming colleagues, women identifying colleagues, femme identifying colleagues, particularly in the field of religious studies, are either folks are stealing their work, if we're keeping it a buck, or marginally engaging with them. How in your work are you engaging in the rich archive and the rich work that so many of our colleagues who don't get the due credit they deserve have offered for us to think with?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. For me, I mean, this is such a hard one, precisely because I intentionally read across so many different fields. And so, immediately within the study of Black religion, I don't think my work would be possible without a Zora Neale Hurston or a Charles Long or Yvonne Chirot, Diane Stewart, Tracy Hucks, Judith Weisenfeld, like the list goes on and on. I think Black studies scholars, thinking a little bit broadly here, Royce Hartman is all over how I think about archives. I think Christina Sharp in conversation there. Excel Carrera has been insightful for me, at least thinking about perhaps a certain kind of philosophy of the archive in certain instances, even thinking with Frank Wilderson, thinking with a host of other folks who are really pushing the limits of what we're doing and why we're doing it. I think honestly, I want to say, I think Black studies is in crisis, precisely. It's in crisis. It's time to perhaps, I think citational practice is a way to get at how we are in crisis, because I think even the moment calls for us to think about why it's a problem to cite certain individuals, or why it's a problem to engage certain individuals, or why certain schools of thought are off limits. And I just don't think that way. I mean, for me, I read. I try to read as much as I can, and I disagree, sure, critique, sure, but like, I don't know how we do our work in silos and in isolation without cross engagement. And so I I think your question is helping me to think about how in certain fields we cannot speak certain names, and why that is. I think that that's something to think about. And relatedly, I guess, you can most assuredly respond to the same question, or I'll present a different one before we open up for Q&A. But like, what is your vision for the study of Black religion within Black studies? Like, what is your vision? Where would you like to see the field go?
No, it's an important question that I'll forever be thinking, hopefully, and prayerfully about this question. But for me, I think it's just to really, if anything, in the short time we have, is just to really put a bow. I mean, just to to italicize what I've been trying to work through in speech this hour, is to experiment, is to not be afraid, and there may be a better word for that that I just don't have right now, to draw out what's in you, and that may seem simplistic, but that's so important. One of my favorite quotes is from Miles Davis. He said, it takes a person a long time to learn how to play like themselves. And I think that's a statement about study, and in many ways, right, and in relation to others. And so there's a reason why for so much of my work I study with. That's why I opened up and talked about sampling. For me, I think with our colleagues and scholars, but I also think about the producers. And at my best, I hope that there are those who would think, if there's anything kind to say about my work, I hope that folks think with me as a producer of sorts, the sampling, the layering, the experimentation. When I learned about, my favorite producer and favorite thinker, one of them ever, Jay Dilla, and the stories of Dilla and crate digging and spending hours with like other producers like Madlib. And, we know the stories of, these producers will spend hours on their knees crate digging. It took me a while to be comfortable enough to think this, that many of us as scholars, we're not in dissimilar conversations. Like, before I knew what study was, my mom would drop me off at half price bookstores. Shout out to those who know what half price bookstores is. And like, she would give me like $15 and say, boy, make it last. And she could go to the mall. She can go to, we ain't gonna, do product placement. She goes to a lot of stores around that shopping center. And guess what? She can shop and get whatever she wants. Because when she came back, Junebug would be in that corner looking up at some Black studies, looking up some novel, looking up some poetry, then looking at some, and I probably have shout out to Half Price, I probably have a stack of books this high, like shout out to The Price is Right, right? You can get right at 15, don't go over. So it'd be like 14.47 or something like that, right? And but yet it was creative, right? I was thinking through something. But there's something about our work that for many, the word imagination, right, is not allowed into the discourse. And for some reason, this idea of thinking with others. So what I want to do in my work is precisely what we're practicing here, family, is to think with others, to really think about what are you offering. And I think that I appreciate your statement about citational practices, because last thing I'll offer is, I came to Black studies late in the game, and I got my first degree in Bible. I used to lie. I think my CV is still lying, because I think my CV still says religion. And for my bachelor's, talking about respectability, my bachelor's is in biblical studies, right? My bachelor's in biblical studies. My master's is a wee bit more respectable in many respects, is in theological ethics, but when I made the decision to pursue Black studies on the doctoral level, for my first year, I think the most critical feedback I got back is, you do solid work, you don't say nothing in seminar, because I didn't have the language. I didn't get my undergrad in Africana studies. I didn't get my undergrad in histories and minored in AFAM. Like, the most critical thing I think I could say in 2016 was like, Jesus was a construction worker who was killed by the Roman Empire. Like, I was like, and I mean, I could talk about Cone, Cone is Black studies for me, and we talk about that on Wednesday, but like, folks were talking about like Hartman and Sharp, and folks were talking, I mean, even just the canonical, I mean, even like Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism. And I took Bernard Hesse's Decolonial Black Political Thought as my first course, and I just stood there the whole fall like, this is a strange and beautiful tongue. Like, and I mean, like, I didn't know it, I didn't have it. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about Black study, because I've had to work hard to develop this beautiful, beautiful, haunting language of Black study, and I want to develop that language with others. So I say that to your point, family, because I'll use the beefs. I don't those beefs. I can't really have those beefs because like I'm just a nerd. So I'll read some work over here, and I'm just like, I want to learn. I want to listen to the sound. I want to see like, how is this work shaping me? And I think you relate to this, those of us who are familiar with seminaries. Like, I just left that beef. Like, I just left the Calvinists, ain't banging with the Arminians, ain't banging with the secessionists, ain't banging with this group. So I fled seminary to Black studies, and hearing y'all ain't messing with each other either over here. And I'm just like, oh no, y'all like, I crossed heaven and earth not to be one of the Theo dude bros over there arguing at Starbucks over theology and what's going to happen in the eschaton. Like, I moved heaven and earth to get out of that conversation. Y'all ain't about to trap me over here with the same mess, but it's different because we just draping it in theory and discourse. It's the same, it's the same mess right here. I'm interested in thinking with others. I'm interested in growing. I'm interested in being pushed. I'm interested in crate digging with others, and I'm interested in building collectives. I love when I listen to the documentaries on Dilla and hear about those producers would just be 3 a.m. in the basement, just nerding out over like random ass samples from the 60s and 70s. And I'm like, that's Black study for me, and in an important sense. Like, Doc Foster as a historian, like when that brother speaks, I'm like, that, like, talk fam, like, I don't lose nothing, I gain something. And that's what I want to do, and what I want to be a part of. And if I contribute something to the murmuration, praises be. But if I'm just a brother who nerds out with other kinfolk over this thing we call Black study, I'm fine with that, because I just love crate digging, and I love crate digging with others. And I think this conversation about Black study and citational practices get to that. So I'm looking forward to the questions and pursuing this further with you all.
That was an excellent handoff, James. I appreciate it. And Ahmad, wow, that was a really tremendous offering and conversation, traversing not only the work that you all have published, but the work that you're working on, right? I do believe that Black studies has something dynamic to offer if we're able to hold space vulnerably and critically, right? Where we meet and where we depart. Because I don't think everyone should be in the same lane or silo. And if anything, the best of Black studies speaks to those various modes of inhabiting Blackness. So I guess I'll turn it over to Q&A and ask folks to drop in questions in the Q&A. We're going to finish at 6:20 sharp, and hopefully we'll be able to get in 3 or 4 questions. James, your concluding thoughts on the difficulty in 2016. With the grammar of a Black studies, right, at the doctoral level, both makes me happy that you were in a space of growth and transformation, and like cringe, because that kind of difficulty just uttering your own Black experience in that space, I think is a part of the problem. But my question to both of you to begin is, what makes your project a Black studies project, which for me means understanding for my students often that if we're in a critical Black history survey, Blackness is a critical category of analysis that helps us better understand what falls in and outside of the discipline of history and or religious studies and or sociology, et cetera, et cetera. And so very simply, what makes your project a Black studies project, right? And then I'll chime in some questions. We got one in the Q&A already, but we'll start there and then move forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question. For me, my work, well, first of all, it centers Black people and Black histories, Black cultures, Black religion. But first and foremost, I think of Black people as epistemological agents, right, who are orchestrating our own ideas, notions of the divine, of the sacred, not always in response to anti-Blackness or white supremacy, but more so as a way of moving through this world as we know it. And when I say world, I do in that very kind of theological religious studies kind of way, think of a distinction between the world and the earth. And so thinking the world being structured by systems of domination, and the earth as being this other entity that is extra to, or perhaps exceeds the confines of this world system. And so if we take Black religious subjects at their word, that this world is not our home, one, but then also that there are other worlds to be made, or there are other worlds that we perhaps can commune with, even thinking about, certain kind of Africana esoteric tradition of communing with planets or the stars or what have you. There's something there that really fascinates me, and I think we have to honor it. We have to center it. And it has to be the entry. And so I actually don't center white people at all in my work, and I do so unapologetically. And I think that is part of a certain kind of moral imperative, political imperative as a Black Studies project. And like working against sources that are like just plain old anti-Black is in itself, I think it takes a certain kind of Black studies training to do that work. And I don't think everyone who does that work does it well, thinking about, recapitulating the scene of subjection. I think there's so much of that work. I know someone had put in the chat a question about trauma and these scenes, right? There's something about them as a cultural cachet in the academy. I'm less interested in that. I'm not interested in like recapitulating the scene, but I think we do have to like sit with the conditions that make the scene possible. And I'm trying to understand that, and trying to understand like where are Black people as these scenes are being reified over and over and over again.
And I think I think I can say this quickly because I echo so many of Ahmad's points, and I think this is why we are not only kinfolk, but we are deep interlocutors in our own research. And I want to echo something I said on Wednesday during our reading group. In the church, we say, my life verse, but I think my professional quote comes from an interlocutor we've already lifted up in this conversation, Toni Morrison, in an interview where she's talking to a reporter, and the reporter basically asked her, when's she gonna put some more white folk in the work, and in classic Morrison fashion, she says, not only do you not know how profoundly racist that question is, but you don't even know how I'm already in the mainstream. And when I think about my work, and I think part of what I think my work as Black Studies is I really don't know. I'm not going to say it's not, but I don't know how my work is going to get picked up in my own field. I'm a theorist of religion. And if you ask me, is my first book and is my work going to get picked up in religious studies department as works of theory and not just as like the sort of subfield, whatever? When I'm listening, if Ahmad can speak to this, but when I was coming out, in my program, when we talk about theorists of religion, it was like Charles Long and what do you think about Cone? It was like, but yeah, when you start talking about white theorists, we're talking like theorists. You got 5-6 pages of white folks who are marked as theorists, but the moment you started talking about Black theorists of religion, it was like, are they historians? It's like you had to go through so much. And for me, my first book is on Michael Jackson and really Michael Jackson as a problem of and for religious thought. And it's a work of theory. It's a work of, and we're talking phenomenology and a host of other things, but the reason why I foregrounded this with Morrison is that I'm not trying to make it legible by, here's these 8 non-white folks that then, okay, I know what they're saying. I mean, we can engage them. I engage the folks who are useful, but to actually have a work that's foregrounded by the interlocutors we mentioned, Sharp and Hartman and Nicole Fleetwood and so many other brilliant folks, and then putting them in conversation with and putting them in the conversation with Judith Weissenfeld, putting them in conversation with my advisor, Robert Orsi, and say, at the end of the day, this work about this gifted, troubled Black man tells us something not only about, the Jehovah's Witness and American religious history, it says something about the production of religious knowledge and the destabilization of the modern locations, modern notions of the proper location of religion. It's doing something else, but I think the Blackness, or what I aspired to be the Blackness of that project, is that many folks in my field will look at the work and be like, maybe I can put this in my, seminar on popular culture. But, when you think about what constitutes theory, I'm okay with joining the others and doing work that the folk understand. But, there'll be other folks who'll always say, like, it doesn't meet the mark because, because it doesn't engage the citational, practices that they demand, and B, to quote another interlocutor, Wilderson, that by attending to Michael, I might be attending to someone marked as too Black for care. And by caring for Michael critically and rigorously and intentionally and intensely, that may make my work outside, the purview of some others. And I couldn't express enough, I'm okay with that.
We're okay with you, and thank you very much. There's two more questions that I want to just read quickly, and then I'll let you all answer them how you will. So the first one is from Andre Guilford, who writes, in what way do you suggest for the violence of the archives to be addressed without the Black archivists being further harmed by doing that work? Wow, couldn't agree more. How do you imagine religious spaces as complicit in aiding this effort? And the other question, I'll get to Delisha as well, but Roz Michael Brown writes, the call for experimentation is brilliant. How should scholars, especially early career scholars, manage the risks of experimentation while contending with the demands for replicating conventions inherent in gaining standing and recognition within academic discipline? So important. And Delisha's comment is a shout out. So Ahmad, James, I'll let you all answer those how you will.
Oh, yeah. The question about, if I'm reading it correctly, is about care, like how might historians and archivists care. I think often about that Ashley Farmer piece at Black Perspectives. I think it's titled Archiving While Black, and thinking about how archives, one, had no kind of idea that Black historian was an actual thing, and so that the Black archivist was a thing, and so they're structured in all these anti-Black ways, and so even thinking about how our papers and materials get cataloged and characterized is in itself an anti-Black enterprise, and then also being in the reading room, being in these spaces that are inherently anti-Black. I am actually working on a piece that's actually thinking about this question. It's a longer form piece. I encountered in the archive at an institution that I won't name just yet, but it will be named, where they had materials from a conjurer from the late 19th century, mojo bags, and all sorts of root-working materials, and they were just thrown in a box. And the archivist, who was a white person, brought them to the table and just kind of scattered the materials on the reading room table. And, it was like immediately I was confronted with the question of the ethics of, one, how did you get these materials? And then two, like, why are they being like just thrown on the table in this way? And then to me, it seemed like he and the archive and that institution were suggesting that there were no power in those Black religious objects. So then also a denunciation again of Black religion. And as I dug deeper into the story of how they acquired that collection, I learned that a man who many of you probably are familiar with, who founded Without Sanctuary, who identifies as a picker in the Jim Crow South, goes into Black people's homes, searches under mattresses, jokes about going to Black people's homes, senior citizens' homes, knocking on the door, saying he had to use the bathroom. And while they would let him use the bathroom, he would actually go into their closets and still, all this kind of thing. And then this ends up in a university archive, right? And so just a question of like, even the materials that we have to work with are acquired in these very violent means. And so like, how then do we confront that legacy as we're doing our work? And so I'm trying to think about that question, and how we name like where these materials are from as we are crafting these historical narratives, because I think they most certainly color how we approach the archive. So that's kind of my first part answer to that question. And the second part is, I think having self-care rituals, spiritual rituals, even before and after one goes into the archive is important. A certain kind of protection rituals or cleansing rituals, whatever that might mean or look like for you, is important, whether it be, you know, working with herbs or whether it be spiritual baths or prayer or whatever. And so I think of my work as a historian as a sacred work. And so I take it very seriously. And there are these ways that I have to be careful about the energies that I pick up as I do the work. And so it is about self-care, and then also being in community with people who can help you shoulder these very, very traumatic energies that are in the archive, and that the archive literally transmutes to Black scholars of Black religion.
And I'll just follow up with the brilliant question about the relationship between experimentation and then managing the demands and gaining standing. And I would say, you know, I'm on Twitter often, and first I'm saying it's a great question. It's something that we always should be thinking of, both Ahmad and I as early career scholars. Like we are of all of the things that are expected out of us and things we need to attend to. And I can say that because we've been in many of the same working groups, and we are in very similar working groups, both in grad school and in our early careers. And one thing I'll say also to that is, we've also noticed on Twitter and through social media that there are those, I'm thinking of one colleague who went viral, having something like 10,000 citations and like doing everything above and beyond at a well-known university, and got denied tenure. And it became an outrage because this person had not just met the bar, but this person had gone above the bar and went above, and they came back and voted down no. And I think it was an outrage, not because that was just implausible and so above the pale of reason. It was an outrage because it was one of those, again, it happened again. And so I think about that in lieu of this question, because my project was not the project I came into, as the case for many. It wasn't the project I came into the program with. I had it still traces me. In fact, it's a forthcoming work that I'm going to return to soon, but it wasn't the project I'm doing right now. But the way I think of myself as an artist and I identify myself as an artist, there came a point early enough in the program where I was like, I can't let thinking about Michael and Black music and popular culture and his Black life and his Black death and the construction of celebrity, like that won't let me go. And I had a lot of people who I respect and who wish me nothing but the best, who were like, you might want to think about that being your second book, because working on a single figure, that's you know, you think of, you know, Robin D.G. Kelly's work on Monk, and you think of so many other scholars, you know, work on Paul Robeson and Billie Holiday. Like, it's not their first book. They kind of get tenure at this, and so they were giving me great advice, and I don't want to lose that. Some of them may be on the screen. So like, it was great advice, but the thing is, I couldn't do that because I needed to attend to that need to experiment, that need to, you know, just work out what was inside of me. But here's the deal. I don't want to romanticize that, because I was going into the market thinking that like this project may not work. In fact, I had many conversations with Ahmad of being like, I don't know, fam. Like I'm over here talking about Michael Jackson and Blackness and the Jehovah's Witnesses and, you know, him getting beat as a boy and him violence as a child and art and short films, music videos and the after, like, there may not be room for me, family. And like, but like the thing was, I was like, but it's gonna have to be okay, because whatever I do to fit in, I'm gonna have to do to stay in. And the thing is that we have so many colleagues who will attest to this. When you're like, I'm not going to tend to what's inside of me, and I'm not going to experiment, and I'm not going to press here, I'll wait 7 years. Ask them 12, 13 years later, how's that going out? How's that going for them? They never get to it. They never got to it, because then guess what? There's always going to be one more thing and one more metric, right? And so I don't want to romanticize any of this, because it's Terpsichorean. It's a dance, right? That none of us are outside of. But for me, I made peace with the fact that not just because I had any foresight, because the market is the market. Like, I'm like, I could do the most, traditional project out there and I still may be on the outside looking in. It ain't got nothing to do with me. It's just like, this ain't a meritocracy, right? And so if you become a finalist for any of these jobs, you still don't have you have at best, what, a 33% chance if you 1 out of 3. And so, you still, your best odds are 33%. And so the odds ain't in our favor in none of this stuff, right? And so we have to negotiate that however we negotiate. And there's no one way to negotiate that. What I've done, because of how I relate to my work and my process and what I need to do, I have nothing in my, last thing I was saying from in the spirit of autoethnography, nothing in my life has been stable. And I think that this is why it's important to foreground the personal. I'm not just giving thoughts from abstraction. I moved 9 times in 18 years, right? I've talked about my father, who I love, talked about my family. So it's very difficult for me to talk about linear, expectations, not because it's not true, but because that's not my experience. I've never followed A. If you do A, you get B, you get C. That has never mapped onto my life. Also, I am neurodivergent as well. So not only am I neurodivergent and left-handed, nothing in my life has been stable. So my call for experimentation, I'm neurodivergent, I'm left-handed, I moved 9 times out of 18 years. I'm not the brother you're gonna talk to about like how to just like that. And there's so many people who give you great advice about that. But what I've said is when I've tried to do things the linear way, like it didn't work it worked very few times. And so if there's any advice, I really hesitate to give advice. But if there's anything I can offer to think with is that do great work, right? Because it's not the fact like my work on Mike is just me just writing a journal for 200 pages about why, Michael Jackson is someone I want to think with. Like I'm doing some heavy lifting, like I'm thinking with some folk, right? Like I'm doing the work. Like I'm like my advisor is Robert Orsi, preeminent Catholic historian, theorist of religion. Like I'm talking with Bob heavy in my research, right? Bob is a mentor and a theorist who we have through the work and beyond the work. We have heavy dialogue about how I'm honoring his work and where I'm trying to extend it, expand it, and think under it, think over it, think through it. And I'm doing the work and I'm happy with the work I've done. And so what I can offer is just do the work you need to do it rigorously. If it's Black work, do it with the care that must be undertaken to do work. And at the end of the day, I hope and believe that you can be at peace with the fruit of your own labor, and those who receive it will receive it. But knowing the market, we have so many examples, unfortunately, of those who spoke the king's English to the queen's liking, and they still on the outside of this whole thing, and it ain't got nothing to do with their inability to play the game right. The game is rigged, and it ain't rigged in none of our favors. And so experimentation is the way I'm able to love my babies at night, because if I wasn't an experiment, I don't know what I'd be doing. And so I hope there's something in that is generative for you and others to think with.
Too much generative, and we're too grateful for the time that you've shared with us, the kind of not just advice, but working through this question of how we break through and break from tradition, the traditions that give us the foundations that we are on, and the places we want to go. So again, I wish we were in person so you would hear the round of applause right now for the conversation y'all just had. But with that not being said, we're all clapping for you. I want to let the rest of the folks who are still on the call know that next week, at the same time at 5 p.m., we'll have another conversation with Dr. Chad Infante and Dr. Tyrone S. Palmer titled The Philosophical Negativity of Black and Native Feeling. This conversation will be archived at the Gilboa Center Public History website for future scholars and folks to learn from. So once again, thank you also very much for being here. We look forward to reading your work and being in conversation with you moving forward. Enjoy your weekend, and please take care.
Thank you all.